to join and then we'll start.
Text, the workshop will begin shortly. Share questions and comments in the chat window on the right side of your screen. Questions will be reviewed during the Q&A period. Feedback, bit.ly/3085 capital B lowercase u capital D.
The webinar will begin shortly. We'll give a few more seconds to allow others to log in.
Follow us on Twitter at NIA_SBIR.
Welcome everyone to the pre-application webinar, Preclinical Development of Novel Therapeutics Targeting Aging Mechanisms. We will begin shortly, but before we do, we'd like to go over a few housekeeping announcements. We want to make this an interactive webinar, and so we have enabled a question and answer period that will be at the end of the session. However, we encourage you to send us questions throughout the entire presentation. We'll also be using the chat window that's on the side of your screen or maybe on the bottom, depending on your computer. There you'll see some links that we'll be chatting out to you so that you can follow along the presentation and see where many of the resources are. Following the presentation, we'll also send you an email with many of these links. This webinar is being recorded, and we are also closed captioning and Zoom technical support. We'll also share the slides after the webinar. We do want to collect your feedback, and please let us know what you think, what you want to hear of in the future. We'll chat out the link to that feedback form. And we'd also like to encourage you to follow us on Twitter. We also have a new LinkedIn page, and we welcome you to join that as well.
Title slide, Pre-Application Webinar, Preclinical Development of Novel Therapeutics Targeting Aging Mechanisms, SBIRISTTR U44. Yellow arrows point to a camera icon labeled Q&A next to the chat and raise hand icons.
With that, we'll get started. Next slide, please.
Agenda.
On our agenda today, we will be going through a presentation of the SBIR U44 RFA AG 21026, and I'd like Rebecca Fuldner and Todd Haim will be leading the NIA OSBR presentation. Then we'll have a moderated Q&A with our panelists.
Featured speakers. Photos of Rebecca Fuldner, Health Scientist Administrator, Chhanda Dutta, Chief of the Clinical Gerontology Branch, Todd Haim, Chief of the Office of Small Business Research, and Moderator Monique Larock, Senior Vice President at Ogilvy.
With that, I'd like to introduce our esteemed guest speakers. We have today Dr. Rebecca Fuldner, Dr. Chhanda Dutta, as well as Dr. Todd Haim. I will be your facilitator and moderator for today. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first guest speaker.
Text, RFA AG 21-026, Preclinical Development of Novel Therapeutics Targeting Aging Mechanisms. 7 webinar sections.
So hello, I'm Rebecca Fuldner from the Biology Division of Aging Biology at the NIA. And I will be giving a little bit of background and rationale for the development of this particular FOA. Next.
Section 1, Background and Rationale, Geroscience and Premise for Geroscience-Based Translation. A circular diagram titled Hallmarks of Aging lists cellular and molecular level changes.
So as you know, the field of geroscience has been advancing rapidly over the last decade. And I think we're at the point now where the interrelationship between the different processes of aging and the development and progression of age-related, different various conditions, age-related conditions, is now pretty well appreciated. On the right of this slide, I have one of the representations of the different hallmarks of aging that's been available in the literature now. This one actually for almost 7 years, and this indicates the different mechanisms and processes of aging that can contribute to the development and progression of age-related diseases. So we have a large range of processes that have been identified to be affected by aging, such as impaired cell proteostasis. These are cellular and molecular mechanisms for the most part. There's DNA damage and genomic instability, which can lead to an increase in the number of senescent cells, as well as depletions of the stem cells. And there's mitochondrial dysfunction, as well as inflammatory cytokine production that also have been shown to be contributors to different age-related conditions. So all of these different mechanisms can be modulated by, and there's a lot of research been done on how they can be modulated by different drugs or therapies. Next slide.
Background and rationale.
Yeah, which has been ongoing for several years. There's been a lot of different work done through the intervention testing program, for example, which tests the ability of different compounds and interventions to prolong the lifespan. And those studies have led to a lot of more mechanistic studies that then try to determine which of these different hallmarks of aging is affected by that compound or intervention. And then, there's further work done, but most of the work that's done on the mechanisms of aging has really has not resulted in a lot of different compounds being brought, entering the translational drug development pipeline and going into first-in-human trials. Instead, there's a lot of work done to understand those interactions between the different hallmarks of aging, but we really feel that there was more work needed to try to develop these products further into in the translational pipeline. For example, the mTOR inhibitors, which were identified as part of the intervention testing program, led to a lot of different studies on different types of inhibitors of the mTOR pathway and mimetics. And a lot of those, there's been a lot of research, basic research done on those, and they're now being developed for various indications, but there's more work that needs to be done. So what I wanted to mention also was a lot of these different interventions on the different, that affect the different hallmarks of aging that can either affect that rate of aging and affect the development of age-related pathologies may have more than one indication, because there are a lot of these hallmarks of aging are prevalent in different physiological systems, different different cells within different organ tissues. And so they can, of course, then develop alterations in the development and progression of age-related conditions in multiple physiological systems at once. So it's very important when you're doing these types of studies to try to understand what the multiple indications for this new or repurposed drug could be, and also to look at what the possible on-target and off-target adverse events for these compounds might be, because they may affect different tissues differently. And that's a difficulty of doing this type of research, but it's important to understand before going further with work. Next.
Background and rationale continued. Need for more systematic development of potential geroscience-based therapeutics, including pleiotropic effects and mechanisms of interest, geroscience-based candidate compounds, and therapeutic goal and clinical indications.
So the FDA has recently started to review some of these types of geroscience-based drugs and therapies. For example, most of you are probably familiar with all the class of senolytic drugs that have been developed. It can remove senescent cells, which is one of the hallmarks of aging, the increased number of senescent cells. And these are being reviewed in addition to some new biologics or stem cell-based therapies, or even repurposing of previously FDA-approved drugs for other indications. So it's important, as I was saying, to understand the on-target and off-target effects of these drugs, because they can have different effects on different tissue types and physiological systems. And also risk reward kind of benefit has to be determined. And again, trying to figure out what the different clinical indications and being able to define the clinical indications for these therapies is important before developing this further. So we felt that there was a need for a more systematic development of these geroscience-based therapeutics, which was the rationale for putting together this FOA, this SBIR announcement. And I guess, yeah. So this SBIR announcement does consider both fast track and phase 2, direct to phase 2 applications. We'll accept both of them, but depending on which critical steps of development that you are focusing on, that will help you determine which mechanism is the best for your application. And Chhanda will be going into some of the examples of fast track versus direct to phase 2 applications in her portion of this presentation. Okay, thanks.
Section 2, Research Objectives and Requirements of the RFA.
So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Rebecca. My name is Chhanda Dutta. I'm from the Division of Geriatrics and Clinical Gerontology at the NIA. And for my portion of the webinar, I'm going to take you through some relevant sections of the RFA. It's a complex RFA. There's a lot of information included in the text, and we strongly encourage you to carefully review all the sections of the RFA. But our goal for the webinar today is to highlight specific sections and to direct your attention to specific issues which we feel applicants need to give some thought to as they compile their applications. Next slide, please.
A diagram made up of arrow-shaped phases of drug development, from discovery to clinical development in phase 1 and 2 trials.
So as Rebecca pointed out, many of these geroscience-based drugs, compounds, whether they're repurposing or repositioning of existing compounds, very few of them are entering into this preclinical development pipeline. So in this figure at the top, we have the discovery section, and the NIA has different FOAs for supporting discovery types of studies. And we also have different FOAs to support the clinical development. However, this U44 RFA is really intended to support the kinds of studies that are needed for these geroscience-based compounds in the preclinical drug development pipeline. So for example, if you need to have target validation studies, lead optimization, the manufacturing and chemistry issues that need to be resolved, and then preclinical toxicology, these are the types of activities that we intend to support through this RFA. And really, regardless of where you start in the process, we'd like for you to get closer to an IND, whether it's IND enabling studies or actual submission of an IND, so that you're able or you're best poised to start planning for first in human studies or phase 1 clinical trials. Now, the RFA has a long list of types of studies that are eligible for this RFA. For the purposes of this webinar, to keep to the time, I just want to highlight that one of the unique features of this RFA is that we allow you to actually develop assays and methodologies that may not be available now, but are needed for the preclinical development of your compound. And in particular, because these are geroscience focused preclinical studies, we would like for you to address potential age-related differences, sex-related differences, an opportunity to develop new assay systems, whether it's organoids or iPSC cells, to look at in vivo and in vitro pharmacology, especially in vitro human models early in the preclinical development process, and also, as Rebecca pointed out, to address any organ or tissue-specific effects that these compounds may have. We feel that these kinds of studies are important to get an idea of what the on-target and off-target effects of these compounds might be fairly early in the drug development process. Next slide, please.
Information on FDA review of geroscience-related IND applications. Development or repurposing or geroscience-related drugs may raise novel issues.
So the geroscience-based translation is challenging. By no means do we want to say it's a simple process. There's a lot of territory that's uncharted, and in this context, the NIA leadership has been in discussions with the FDA, but clearly a lot of the regulatory implications for the geroscience-based translational types of studies remain in the uncharted territory. And one of the goals of this RFA is to facilitate dialogues between individuals interested in developing these geroscience-related drugs with the FDA, so that we can give them actual examples of products, actual issues that they need to think about in terms of clinical indications and other regulatory aspects of these kinds of drugs. And so the NIA, if you've gone to the landing page for the RFA, we have a thought piece that's there on some suggestions and things that the NIA has been thinking about that's important to think about in the geroscience-related translation and submission of IND applications. And for example, as Rebecca mentioned, the geroscience-based drugs have the potential to favorably affect multiple outcomes. And as such, we think that they have hope for promoting healthy aging. And because of that, you would anticipate that there would be widespread use of these kinds of drugs. So that raises challenges, especially in terms of defining the indication and the context of use. So if there's widespread use of these, anticipated widespread use of these drugs, it is worth to spend some time thinking about the heterogeneity within the population that may produce substantial differences in the drug's risk to benefit ratio, and also to give some thought about the breadth and the depth of evidence, both from the safety and the efficacy standpoint, across different kinds of aging phenotypes as well as disease subgroups. There's a couple of options that you have in terms of the first-in-human studies and in planning for the preclinical development of your compounds. You can have a single outcome measure, for example, such as functional deficits. You can think about multiple individual outcomes, or a composite or a subset of those multiple individual outcomes. Or you can use global outcomes such as disability or all-cause mortality as basis for claims. What we're intending for you to do within your applications for this RFA is to give these issues some thought well in advance of the point where you may reach a first-in-human study, so that it's a more informed preclinical drug development process and less likely to fail in the future if you plan for these things in advance. And one final point is, since we are targeting aging mechanisms and we're trying to influence health, promote healthy aging, there's also an opportunity to develop and use novel predictive biomarkers and surrogate endpoints, and the extent to which you can validate these measures and look at some of these issues before you get to testing them in humans during the preclinical drug development process is also something we want you to think about in your application. Next slide, please.
RFA requirements for periodic FDA meetings under TPP.
So continuing on this theme about enhancing our interactions with the FDA about geroscience-based translation, one of the requirements of this RFA is frequent meetings with the FDA, periodic meetings, and in fact, at least a meeting before you submit your application, because we require you to submit a target product profile as part of your application, your research strategy plan for the U44 application. Most of you are probably familiar with what a TPP is, but fundamentally it's a roadmap. It's a strategic development tool that helps you plan well in advance of what your clinical indications might be. And as the FDA indicates, ideally it would be expressed in terms of the labeling requirements that you envision for your drug. We encourage you to think about the TPP. It's a requirement of the RFA, and we made it this way because we feel it has a couple of advantages. If you start to talk to the FDA fairly early in the process, they will be able to help you identify additional kinds of studies that you may need for your particular compound, efficacy studies, histological studies, collection of biopsies. The other thing is if your claim or your clinical indication cuts across multiple outcomes, it's very likely that you'll be interacting with multiple divisions, because the FDA divisions are very much organized by physiological systems and disease categories. And so if you start interacting with them early in the process, the FDA can help you coordinate your application or your drug across the various divisions that may be involved in the regulatory discussions. Regardless of where you start in the process, in the preclinical drug development process for this U44 RFA, we expect that successful applications would, for example, be either poised at the end of the funding period to start their IND-enabling studies, or if you're at more advanced stages of translation, you will probably be poised to actually submit the IND application to the RFA. And this might be the case, especially for drugs that are being repurposed. Next slide, please.
Studies outside of scope of RFA are non-responsive applications.
So we just want to have a few words about things that we feel are outside the scope of this RFA or would be considered as non-responsive. So as I mentioned before, we have other options for individuals interested in early stage discovery studies. So those would not be appropriate for this RFA. Any kind of study that focuses on an aging condition, if it's osteoarthritis, urinary incontinence, functional deficits, but you really don't have an understanding of what the underlying mechanism of this compound is, that would not be appropriate for this RFA. We expect you to identify which mechanisms, aging mechanisms, are being targeted by your particular compound in your U44 RFA, and we expect you to provide proof of concept data on those kinds of things. And then finally, drug development primarily focusing on Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's disease-related dementias are also considered out of the scope of the RFA. Our Division of Neurosciences at the NIA has an extensive number of FOAs available for translational research on AD, ADRD, and we encourage you to look at that link. It's included in the RFA to look at what FOA might be appropriate for your interests in that regard. And then finally, regardless of what your idea is, we want to hear from you. Please contact us in advance of your submitting your application, because we want to make sure that you're responsive to the RFA, and if not, we can certainly be helpful in guiding you to other NIA FOAs that might be more appropriate for your proposed project. Next slide, please.
Section 3.
Okay, so Rebecca alluded to this. We want to take a few minutes just to talk about how you would think about choosing between a fast track and a direct to phase 2 application. Next slide.
Program phases and funding levels. A table breaks down the following awards: Phase 1, Discovery and Feasibility; Phase 2, Development and full R&D; and Phase 2B, Competing Renewal. Between Phase 2 and 2B are the options: Fast Track, Direct to Phase 2, SBIR Only, and Commercialization Readiness Pilot.
So the RFA accepts two types of U44 applications: Fast Track, Direct to Phase 2, and we also mentioned the opportunity to apply for the Commercialization Readiness Pilot, the CRP program, during the course of your funded U44 project. If you're making promising research progress, then the CRP enables you to advance your translational research efforts even further beyond the funding provided by this RFA. Next slide, please.
Choosing Fast Track versus Direct to Phase 2 application.
So as we've already talked about, this RFA encourages the submission of applications across all stages of the preclinical drug development pipeline. As you might expect, the amount of data that would be included, proof of concept data and other details, in the application would be based on the type of compound you're proposing for further development. And so, for example, things that are more about drug repositioning and repurposing obviously would have more information already available versus something that is a brand new investigational compound. So in terms of fast track applications, the kinds of things that we think would be suitable are if you're in the position to for refinement and validation of assay methodologies that you need for further development to test the PK properties, look at other kinds of drug toxicity studies. And here I'd like to also mention that in addition to in vitro methodologies, we also encourage you to use in silico approaches for drug development as well. Other kinds of things, you might want to do some pilot studies to look at age differences, sex differences, and the PK/PD characteristics. And then finally, ramp up some of your chemistry or manufacturing activities, look at final formulations, and also scale up your compound in preparation for the IND enabling pharm and tox studies. Next slide.
Choosing fast track versus direct to phase 2 application continued.
So products that are more advanced translational stages. For example, if you already have a lead compound that's optimized and you're about to enter the IND enabling studies, then we feel it's appropriate for you to submit a direct to phase 2 application, which gives you 3 years of support. Some examples of things that would be appropriate for direct to phase 2 are replication studies to establish feasibility of further translational of your particular therapeutics, look at efficacy, look at age-related changes. You may want to do some studies using aged animals, testing different formulations, and again, refinement and manufacturing processes, and also for starting up your pharmacology and tox studies that you need for your IND filing. We do have the option for investigators to apply to the CRP program early in the project, whether it's phase 2 or direct to phase 2. If your translational research progress is promising, you're hitting the milestones, and if things are looking really good, that you are ready to start planning for first in human studies, then there is the option for you to apply to the CRP program early in the funding period. So the CRP enables you to, for example, apply for chemistry and manufacturing, if you need additional funds for tox studies, if you need regulatory input, or any combination of these above, then, and also planning for your protocols for your phase 1 trials, first in human studies, then that's something the CRP program would be appropriate for you to apply to. Next slide, please.
Section 4, Key Aspects of the U44 Application and Review.
Okay, a few words about the key aspects of the cooperative agreement mechanism and the review of applications for this RFA.
Cooperative Agreements.
So many of you are probably aware that a U mechanism is a cooperative agreement, and what that simply means is that NIA staff are substantially involved in your application. Our role for you in your project is really to facilitate and to coordinate the activities. The dominant and primary role for the project itself still resides with the awardee. And so, for example, some of the things that we can be helpful are, in terms of your U44 research progress, is make you aware of other resources. For example, through the an NCATS program at the NIH, or the NIA's intervention testing program. And also we can be of assistance in coordinating your research activities through the NIH Geroscience Interest Group, and also facilitating interactions with the FDA. And we also want to point out, as part of the cooperative agreement, we do require under the RFA for the awardees to participate in annual meetings to be held in Bethesda. Obviously, depending on the COVID-19 situation, if this persists, we would change to a virtual format of some form, but we would anticipate that the first meeting with the awardees would take place within the first 4 months of the project period. Next slide, please.
Research strategy plan, significance, clinical impact and feasibility, and data to support further preclinical development, scientific rationale.
So we want to take some time to go through the research strategy section of your U44 application. And one thing I want to direct your attention to is there was a mistake in the RFA. It failed to mention that we actually have a 30-page limit for the research strategy section and not a 12-page limit. So those of you who read the RFA and thought we were crazy requiring you to pack in all this information in 12 pages, we apologize, it was a mistake. We've published a notice earlier this week correcting that. So I want to emphasize that you do have 30 pages for your research strategy plan. So just to highlight some things that we think are important for you to think about and you need to include in your research strategy plan is some description of the clinical impact and the feasibility of the drug that you're planning to develop. You know, what is the current state of knowledge? How, you know, what evidence is there that demonstrates the relationship between the aging mechanism or mechanisms being targeted in your preclinical development plan and your clinical outcomes of interest. As I mentioned before, you need to include a target product profile based on FDA guidance in your research strategy plan. And then, you know, describe under your scientific rationale, what is the evidence for linking the aging mechanisms with your clinical application, and then provide proof of concept data to support this link. And this can be from experimental models, and whenever possible, if you have that data, we would be very interested in seeing data from human in vitro systems. Next slide, please.
Research strategy plan continued, proposed therapeutic and methodology and assays.
So in terms of the proposed drug that you're hoping to develop, obviously we'd like to hear about the structure, the chemistry, the potency, the stability of the candidate drug. And again, one of the unique features of this RFA is that it actually enables you to develop the methodologies you need to as part of the preclinical development plan. And so describe how these methodologies are critical to advancing your preclinical development, and then provide details on how you plan to validate these methodologies and the feasibility of applying them during the preclinical drug development process. Next slide, please.
Research strategy plan continued, milestones and timelines, and composition and day-to-day communications of multidisciplinary research team.
So many of you are well aware with the SBIRs that milestones and timelines are a critical part of SBIR applications. It's the same for the U44 program. So under the research strategy plan, we actually require you to include a Gantt chart for the entire project period with milestones, and these milestones should be specified for each key objective of your application, and they'll be used for making the go, no-go decisions along the preclinical development pathway. Something else we want to emphasize is the multidisciplinary nature of the research team we expect in these U44 applications. You certainly need to have expertise in aging research, for example, whether it's gerontological expertise or geriatrics expertise, along with the other kinds of expertise that would be standard for the preclinical drug development process. The other thing we would also like for you to include is a team management plan. We want to get an idea of how day-to-day operations will be coordinated and how the lines of communications and decisions will be made in the U44 study during the project period. Next slide, please.
Other important components.
So just to touch upon some of the other important components, letters of support are important, especially for consultants and collaborators. You need to think about your phase 2 commercialization plan. You need to include biosketches for your senior and key personnel. Make sure that your detailed description of facilities and equipment, and of course you need to address human subjects research section if applicable, as well as the vertebrate animal section. Next slide, please.
Review of RFA applications.
So the NIA is going to convene a special emphasis plan panel to review the applications submitted in response to this RFA. And there are additional review criteria that are specified in the RFA, and we ask that you pay attention to those specific additional review criteria, and they pertain to things like milestones and timelines. We just want to make sure that for fast track applications that you specify milestones and aims for each of the phases separately. There are additional review criteria that are targeting market, customer, and competition, your small business concern in terms of prior experience and qualifications of the project team, and also some issues related to intellectual property. Next slide, please.
Section 5, Award Information.
So a few words about the award information for this RFA. Next slide.
Award budget and budget period.
So total funding support, here we've got some numbers in the RFA that's for phase 1 and phase 2, but it's very likely that the project that you have in mind is already approved under the waiver. And so in that regard, your total cost budgets for phase 1 may be up to $450,000. And for phase 2, $1.25 million for phase 2 for up to 3 years. Next slide, please.
Key dates for the RFA.
So we want to remind you of some key dates and timelines for this RFA. So the earliest submission date, is October 10th. The letters of intent, while they're not required, we would greatly appreciate you submitting a letter of intent, and those are submitted to me, and that is also due on October 10th. The application due date is November 10th, and in terms of the review, the council considerations and the earliest start date, the review would take place sometime in February, March of next year, and the earliest start date we envision for the U44 projects would be in July, approximately a year from now next year. Next slide, please.
Section 6, CRP program and other options.
So I just want to touch a little bit upon some of the other options you have if your particular project may not be suitable for this U44 RFA.
Options and other resources, embedded links to other NIA funding opportunities, and information on current opportunities on AD and ADRD.
As I mentioned, those of you that are interested in discovery studies, we have a set of PARs. That means we have special review arrangements for these FOAs that use the R33 mechanism and the R21, R33. I've included the links on the slide here. I encourage you to check them out if that's where your particular interests reside at this point. Again, preclinical development of new drugs for AD, ADRD are outside the scope, but there are a number of FOAs available already issued by the NIA, and here I've provided the link. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Todd now, who's going to talk about the general SBIR program and then the CRP in a little bit more detail. Thank you.
About the National Institute on Aging, nia.nih.gov/SBIR.
Great, thank you. And just to address one of the questions that I've seen come in a couple of times, So for this funding opportunity, we allow phase 2 applications and fast tracks, but we do not allow phase 1s by themselves. So a fast track application will have a phase 1 as part of the fast track. And that's why there is the phase 1 budget limit for the purposes of if you're submitting a fast track. And the advantage of a fast track is that you will be able to transition from the phase 1 to phase 2 if you've met your milestones without having to apply and going through review, and it saves a lot of time on that end. So I manage the Office of Small Business Research at the NIA. Next slide.
About SBIR and STTR.
So the SBIR and STTR programs, for those that don't know and are new to the small business programs, the congressionally mandated set-aside programs that basically require federal agencies that provide money extramurally, in NIH's case to universities, to take a percentage of that money and allocate it specifically to small businesses. And that's done 3.2% through the SBIR program and 0.45% to the STTR program. At the NIH, we use these allocations to really help facilitate that transition from the great basic research that NIH is so strong at supporting to then activities that can lead to commercialization. Next slide.
Why seek SBIR and STTR funding?
It's, a lot of great reasons to get SBIR and STTR funding. It is completely non-dilutive, unlike, getting a private investment. It's not a loan, there's no repayment. They are in fact grants or cooperative agreements, but still essentially grants in terms of you're not having to pay anything back. There's no impact on your stock or your shares. The small business retains the intellectual property rights. A lot of companies have found it really useful when they go and they need to get private investment. Private investors tend to look positively on the validation that comes from getting through the NIH peer review system, and also the fact that you will be able to reach some key inflection points without diluting your shares that then makes it more appealing once an investor does come in. Next slide.
Budget specifics, total cost budgets. SBIR budgets are defined by total cost and subcontracting is limited. Know the rules and criteria. Check the budget allowance in each funding opportunity.
So when you submit your budget, and Chhanda and Rebecca went through what the total budget limits are. When you submit your budget, there are several sections of the budget. A couple to note, you can request a 7% fee, and I always encourage it. It's essentially considered the company profit. If you don't request it in your application, you cannot ask for it later. But you'll find that the NIH is specific in terms of the types of things that it allows you to request funding for in your application, but there will be other costs such as paying your lawyers and things like that, having the 7% fee you could use for that you don't have to explain, and you actually should not explain how you're going to use that fee. That's the only part of the budget that you do not have to justify. And then many companies often ask about fee-for-service type activities. Let's say you need to, take your drug, your compound, and run it through a specific screen. There are CROs that have that screen. Would it be realistic for you to get the equipment in-house and do it? In that case, you can send it to CRO. You can actually count those costs as part of the company's percentage of the costs. And thus that allows for, companies to be partially virtual, but the company should still have a facility and do some of the work itself. Next slide.
Eligibility.
So in order to be eligible for SBIR, it's critical to note that you have to essentially meet the United States Small Business Administration's definition of a U.S. small business, which means there'll be 500 or fewer employees. In reality, most companies refund are more like 10 employees, sometimes much less. And then you have to be owned and operated, majority owned and operated by individuals in the US or by a collection of venture capital operating companies, as long as no single venture capital firm owns 50% of your company or more. Next slide.
We strategically fund innovations.
So just to give you a sense for what we look for in SBIR, if you're interested in SBIR in general, we really fund everything, within the NIA mission. in terms of aging in place, research tools, Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. And then on the slide, we list some additional areas of interest.
Companion diagnostics, bioinformatics, novel cell and gene therapies, biomarkers, prevention and therapeutics, assistive technology, and tools, technologies, and analytic methods to address health disparities.
Next slide.
NIA funding opportunities. A table with opportunities for SBIR and STTR listed under columns for omnibus FOAs and AD and ADRD focused FOAs.
There are several other funding opportunities. If you've gone through this webinar and you now realize that this might not be the perfect funding opportunity for your research, because it is important if you're going to submit to this funding opportunity that your research really matches what it's looking for. If it doesn't, you can definitely apply to the omnibus, which is really investigator initiative. And those links are there, as well as the limits. And then we also have specific funding opportunities for Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. Next slide.
NIA funding opportunities continued with a table listing budget limits for the CRP program, along with supplements and NIA participating initiatives.
One thing that Chhanda mentioned is the Commercial Readiness Pilot Program, the CRP. This is something, once you get the phase 2 funded, it's a new program that we rolled out to help pay for the types of activities that would facilitate transition to the clinic and or commercialization. And it allows for costs that the NIH does not normally fund. Things like paying for your regulatory consultants, for your intellectual property consultants, and all that document prep and filing, as well as actual research activities like your IND enabling, maybe your manufacturing and scale up, things that may not be innovative and thus, don't do great standing alone as a research application, but really do fit the mission of the commercialization readiness pilot program. And that can be up to about $3.3 million total over a 2-year period. And again, you can apply for that anytime after you've been awarded your phase 2, including after you finished your phase 2. And then there are a couple of other opportunities listed here, including diversity supplements. But again, you first have to have you first have to be awarded before you can apply for diversity supplement.
Post phase 2.
So this talks about the commercialization research program in more detail. One of the unique things is that for, let's say, a phase 2 SBIR, at least 50% of the work has to be done by the small business. Those percentage requirements are not present in the CRP. Next slide.
Scope of the small CRP, Part 20-128.
So there's actually two. There's a small CRP that pays for just those technical assistance type activities I mentioned. And then there's a large CRP, next slide.
Scope of the large CRP, Part 20-129 and Part 20-130. That
allows for those costs as well as research and development related activities. And that's the one that's just over $3.3 million. Next slide.
Want guidance? Send us the aims page. Specific aims, 1 page. The executive summary and first impressions. First 1/3 to 2/3 of page. The elevator pitch. Why is it meritorious? Last 1/3 to a half of page. The specific aims for the proposed project.
So finally, if you would like to consider an application, if it's specific to this funding opportunity, you should send, so this slide is a template for the specific aims page. And for an SBIR, it's really one of the key score driving pages. The first half to 2/3 is the elevator pitch. Essentially, you want to be able to, in that first half a page of the aims page, tell the reviewers, why is this the one that they should score the best of all the applications that they're reviewing? And then in the last third to half, you can talk about the specific aims. We will provide guidance on, if your aims are a fit for what you're looking for. If it's for this specific RFA, then please send that to Chhanda and Rebecca. However, you can send it generally to our office if it's for the omnibus or other funding opportunities. Next slide.
Connect with NIA. nia.nih.gov/SBIR. On Twitter, @NIA_SBIR. On LinkedIn, NIA Office for Small Business Research. Email, niasmallbusiness@mail.nih.gov. links to upcoming events, funding opportunities, and mailing list sign up.
So thank you. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to our moderator and our organizing team. And please connect with us going forward. And I look forward to answering more questions. Thank you.
Questions?
Thank you, Todd and Dr. Dutta and Dr. Fuldner. Now we move to our questions. We have been receiving several. I'll just go through a couple that have been coming through pretty regularly. One is, we've gotten a question a couple of times about whether the slides will become available, and we will make them available. We'll also send out some of the links to you via email that we've been chatting out. Okay. First question is, do you envision sometime in the future the FDA approving drugs for treating aging per se, or will aging treatments continue to be evaluated for single indications? I know that we don't have anyone from the FDA on this call, but do any of you want to speak to this comment?
I'll take a stab at that. So this is Chhanda. So as I mentioned during the webinar, the NIA leadership had initiated interactions with the FDA several years ago to talk about the kinds of regulatory issues that you can imagine. And so we feel that at some point in the future, there will be regulatory guidance from the FDA concerning geroscience-based drugs. And your application to this RFA has an important role in developing those regulatory guidelines, because quite frankly, the NIA leadership and the FDA have been having discussions, but until they start to see more IND applications or sponsors approaching them with the intent of developing more of these geroscience-based translational drugs, they don't have any specific examples to think about. So I think now it's uncharted territory. And again, your application to this RFA has an integral role in advancing the ability for the FDA to give us some guidance in the future about geroscience-based drugs.
Thank you. And Todd mentioned during our presentation today that the clarification on whether SBIR phase 1s can apply, and clarified that you can do it if you're part of a fast track. But I wanted to just note that we received that question a few times. Similarly, we have a question of whether there is an STTR equivalent for this opportunity.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there is not per se an STTR equivalent for this RFA. However, we would accept STTRs through the omnibus. But definitely if you think that you're relevant for this RFA, I would definitely suggest speaking with Chhanda and Rebecca. And the U44 type mechanism may still fit. So we can definitely guide you through that if you send us a names page, and we can have that conversation.
Thank you, Todd. And I know we've also received some questions generally about the tech transfer program more broadly. We can chat out some links for that, but I wanted to encourage you to look at our website as well, which will chat out with information about the program and funding opportunities that are available for it.
Great. And I mean, I can just say, so the funding opportunity that I mentioned, PA 18-705, is essentially allows companies to look at the different technologies that have been invented at the NIH and are available for licensing. And then you can actually submit an application to the NIH to work on that technology. And then in addition to, if you are selected, getting at least a research license to work on the NIH invention, you would also get the funding to conduct that work. And then should the project go well and you decide that you would like to fully license the technology, then you would negotiate a full commercial license. But you would at least first be able to get funding, work, and develop it to see if it's something that your company would be interested in really fully developing. So it's a great opportunity. And if you go to that solicitation, there are links to the tech transfer offices and which types of technologies are available for licensing. So definitely encourage you to look at it.
Thank you. I'll to give you guys a quick break and to remind folks, we are still taking questions. You can put those in the Q&A feature. Just tap on the Q&A at the bottom of your screen and you can enter your question there. Also, we encourage you to fill out the feedback form so that we can get more information from you on what you want to hear about in the future. The next question relates to the direct to phase 2 and whether if someone submits data that is deemed to be on the earlier side of development, would their application still be considered?
This is where sending the specific aims page really helps because, everyone has their own definition of early. So, we can directly, provide guidance if your project is at the right stage of development, if you send us that aims page. Chhanda and Rebecca, anything you want to add there?
No, I think you covered it, Todd, right. There is no one size fits all for this RFA, and it's true. Everybody has their own interpretation of what early means. So please send us your aims and we can give you specific feedback on that.
Yeah, I wanted just to reiterate that as well. I mean, if you send us an email, we'll set up a time to discuss, your project with you, and you can send us some aims in advance of the discussion on the phone. And, we're planning to hopefully be able to talk to almost everyone before they send in their letter of intent or after that, because we find that that's really helpful.
Yeah, key is to contact us early. Don't wait until, the week before you submit the application. Might be too late at that point, but we have time now, so I would definitely suggest you doing that sooner rather than later.
Thank you. And everyone, we do sincerely mean it, that we're here to help you answer questions and can look more specifically at what you're proposing. It will help you develop a more successful application if you can get some feedback early on whether this is a good fit and things you should consider in terms of developing a successful application. The next question is just relating to the NIA invention licensing opportunity. They'd like to see if you can repeat that number and any additional information, Todd.
Yeah, it's PA-18-705. It will be, again, we will be sending the slides. So you can see it on the bottom of this slide, well, towards the bottom of the table in this slide. And then it's also linked on our website. So, once you get the presentation, you'll be able to link to it and then contact our office with any questions.
Thank you. Is an early discussion on TPP with the FDA requirements for a U44 application?
Short answer, yes. It's required to be part of your research strategy section of the U44.
Thank you. Next question is a combination device plus drug acceptable?
I hadn't thought about that. This is Chhanda. We would, in this case, as we've been saying, please send us a short background on your combination of a device and the drug, and we'd be happy to chat with you about it after we've had an opportunity to read the details.
Thank you. A couple of folks are thanking you all for this presentation, and they're wanting to know a bit more about different areas that they could apply for under the RFA, so we can speak to those topics, as well as whether they could include digital therapies.
Chhanda, do you want to address the question about digital therapies? Or Rebecca?
I'm actually not clear on what digital therapy means. Can they?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could give us some examples, maybe.
Yeah.
I think that will be a very good case of giving more specifics through a summary on an email.
Okay.
That's all we have for now in terms of the specificity.
Okay.
And just a reminder to all the attendees, we try our best to structure these webinars in a way that provides you all the right guidance. but you know best what we need to be including in these webinars. So we always appreciate you filling out the feedback forms. So the next webinar you attend is even better. So please go ahead and do fill out that feedback form. Really important for us.
Thank you. Question about whether age-related eye diseases, areas that would focus attention on those would be available and applicable to this funding opportunity.
So it depends on, so as I mentioned early in this webinar, if you have an idea for treating a particular condition, a geriatric condition or aging-related condition, it may not be suitable for this U44 RFA unless the mechanism of the drug is targeting an aging mechanism. So a crucial detail or a crucial aspect of this RFA is whatever compound you are developing has to target one of those fundamental mechanisms of aging. And if you have information that your particular compound targets an age-related mechanism, then whether it treats an eye-related compound, eye-related condition or kidney-related condition, I would suspect it would be suitable for this RFA. But again, feel free to contact Rebecca and I with more specific details, and we would be able to give you more specific feedback. Rebecca, did you want to add anything?
No, I think that's, that's the best advice is if we can get some more information from you, then we can, set up time to talk to you about this.
Thank you. A question about whether NIH provides opportunities for interactions with other researchers to combine technologies. They note they work with delivery platform technologies, but would like to develop applications of that for aging research.
So we don't directly, get involved in helping form those collaborations. I mean, we do conduct meetings and workshops around specific topics. And of course, if you attend one of those, then there may be, opportunities there. The one resource, however, that I would definitely suggest is the NIH Reporter database. And essentially anything that the NIH funds, the abstract and budget information and PI contact information will be on the Reporter database. And there's many different fields you could do, including a tech search around specific scientific areas. You can also limit it to small business if you want. You can limit it to your state if you're looking for local local researchers that are, that might be able to help you. So I definitely encourage you to use that Reporter database. You can get the contact information of the people we're funding in whatever the scientific question is. And then you're welcome to contact them and discuss if there would be an opportunity for synergies.
Thank you, Todd. The next question is for you. You spoke during the presentation that many of the companies we fund have 10 or less employees. We did get a question about how early can a startup be to apply, and do they have to have a certain amount of funds raised to be able to apply?
No, they do not have to have any funds raised to apply. Many of our companies do not have any funds when they first apply and they receive their first award. Our goal is to help support the data collection that would then help you attract other funding. You have to have somebody that will move to the company when you get the award or already be in the company. So really in terms of how early, in order to be eligible to apply, that the small business needs to legally exist. And there are several registrations that the small business has to go through. And this is all on our website and we can send links. And then, once a small business goes through those registrations, at that point, you can apply. Many of the other eligibility criteria, such as the PI needs to be at the small business, the facility, there needs to be a facility for the small business. Those are actually at time of award. So now they can be considered in review. So what I always suggest that in terms of, let's say, facility, you can get a letter of support from an incubator, as an example, that states that if you get the award, they will provide you X space and access to Y resources And thus you can get credit for that facility and as the reviewers review your application, but you don't have to actually move in or pay any rent until you know you're getting the funding from us. Similarly, you can have a letter from, the person that you would be bringing into your company as PI, that they plan on joining the company at whatever date should you get the funding. So, all of that can be, can essentially, as we will verify that person's officially majority employed before we issue the award, but they don't have to, so they need to be listed as that they will be the PI and they will be majority employed, but they don't need to be on the day you submit your application.
Thank you, Todd. We have 2 more questions. I recognize we're at time, but just to make sure that we're trying to get as much information out as possible, I'll ask those 2. One, to definitely encourage everyone to please fill out that feedback form. We've linked to it in chat and we'll send that again. Also, please join our community on LinkedIn as well as Twitter. We constantly post tips for applying as well as new opportunities and opportunities to interact and be a part of the network.
And we just launched LinkedIn yesterday, so you'll get to be one of the first. So do it.
Follow us at bit.ly/32 capital A capital V lowercase UH capital Z.
Thank you. So the next question is, have you been able to establish an FDA pre-IND consultation program for aging drugs?
We don't have that kind of a program yet. And again, we're hoping that this U44 RFA will actually give us, some basis, some hard evidence to go to the FDA to start thinking about those kinds of resources.
Thank you. And the last question relates to just again, folks trying to clarify how they fit into this funding opportunity. They want to know whether we would fund early aging conditions for pediatrics, as well as to expand on the digital therapies comment earlier. The researcher is working on virtual reality for Alzheimer's and dementia.
So I'll repeat my earlier comment at the risk of sounding like a broken record. Please just contact us with those ideas. With the one that's on digital therapy that's focusing on AD/ADRD, I would strongly encourage you to go to that link on ADRD FOAs that are issued through the Division of Neurosciences at the NIA. And alternatively, you could also contact Rebecca and I, and we can help you get in touch with the appropriate staff member at the Division of Neurosciences.
Yes, we have a funding opportunity for Alzheimer's disease that includes all approaches, including virtual reality, and we actually have funded a couple of virtual reality solutions recently. So that is actually a really high interest to us. And is definitely a part of that funding opportunity. So I definitely encourage you to get in touch with us. Melissa just sent the information for Dr. M.D. Kearns. If you don't fit this funding opportunity, but you would like some guidance on what you do fit, send us that specific aims page having all the information that I just said to Dr. M.D. Kearns, KearnsMD at mail.nih.gov, and he will be able to answer all of your questions and tell you what the right funding opportunity is, and any SBIR questions and things of that nature.
Thank you, Todd. Just one other extension for you. Can you please help some of the potential applicants, if they have an area of interest that crosses potentially aging and maybe eye disease or diabetes or heart, how is that handled by NIH in terms of who gets the application, and can it be reviewed by the other institute if it doesn't make it through one?
Great question. So I'll say a couple things on that. One, I encourage you to talk to both institutes before you apply and, see kind of which one thinks it's most within their domain. Then in the application, there is a form called the PHS Assignment Request Form. In that form, you can actually request which institute your application gets sent to. More than that, you can also request what's called dual assignment, which means that you can request multiple institutes get assigned that application. And I do recommend that. I mean, there are some rare occasions where your application may just miss, the NIA's funding line, but would fit the NHLBI funding line, or vice versa, depending on the year. There's fluctuation at each institute every year. And thus, if you're assigned to both and you miss ours, but make theirs, or vice versa, then it gives you kind of a second shot in the goal. So, you need to justify kind of why whatever institute you're requesting do fit. But if you think they do, you can definitely request dual assignment. I will say that generally, I mean, if you're doing, heart disease and you're kind of, or eye disease, it would likely go primarily to that institute, unless you're really focused on an aging mechanism as part of that disease, part of the way you're targeting that disease. And then it may potentially come to us.
Thank you. With that, I would like to thank everyone for participating today. We appreciate your time, the questions, and we hope that this is just the start of you interacting and engaging with us. We would truly welcome you to contact us to discuss more in depth what you're thinking about and how we can be of help to you in submitting your application. And I want to also thank Rebecca, Chhanda, and Todd for your expertise and your willingness to help these applicants learn more about the funding opportunities and how to be successful. Thank you everyone for joining, and please do fill out that feedback form and join our LinkedIn and Twitter community. Take care.
Please share feedback at bit.ly/3085 capital B lowercase u capital D.
Thank you.